Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone is safe, washing their hands, and then you have enough food to eat during this horrible times, by the way, but hopefully everyone is safe. Again, today I'm going to be talking about chaining, which is chapter 11, which is the next chapter on this unit. And I'll be posting some announcements regarding some activities as well as office hours next week. Now, on chapter 11, my suggestion would always be that you read the chapter before you attend the lecture, you watch the video lecture. That would definitely, I think, be helpful to you in terms of understanding the concepts that we're going to be discussing here. So chaining is also a procedure to teach behavior. We talk about shaping in the last lecture, and today we're going to be talking about chaining, which is another way of teaching new behavior, of behavior acquisition, right? So we've been talking about behavior acquisition. Now, usually when we use prompting and fading, when we at least talked about it using prompting and fading, we described some simple behaviors. But how about when we're teaching something a little bit more complex? Um, a lot of the behaviors that we engage in on a daily basis involve multiple steps or multiple components, right? If you think about brushing your teeth or brushing your hair or taking a shower or getting dressed, even though you don't think about those behaviors as being very complex, imagine if you were to have to teach to someone else who doesn't know how to engage in those behaviors. It would not be that simple to do it. You would have to somehow break the behavior down into smaller components. So what do you do when you get dressed? What exactly do you do when you brush your teeth? Those are the questions that we're going to be addressing in this unit here, right? So what is chaining? Well, this is again another way to teach new behavior. And a chain is usually defined as a connected sequence of complex behaviors that consist of multiple responses, again, that should occur the same way every time. Now, there might be some variations, and I'll tell you about those variations in a minute. But imagine, like I said, toothbrushing, the things that you do. I mean, you have to put the toothpaste onto the toothbrush before you start brushing your teeth. You can't really brush your teeth and then put the toothpaste and then wash the toothbrush. So there are some sort of fixed sequences or order of events that need to happen. Same with cooking certain foods. If you put the ingredients at different times, it might not turn out correctly. You can, if you have to put something into the oven, it has to be put at a certain time. You can put the eggs after you bake the cake. You have to put the eggs before you bake the cake. You can mix it before you add the flour. You have to add the flour and the milk and the egg and then mix it and then pour it into a pan and then inside of the oven and so forth, if you're baking a cake, for instance. Hand washing, something that we've been talking about a lot. And I'll give an example of that behavioral chain in a second. Putting on a belt, taking medication. So all of these are examples of behavioral chains. So chaining involves training an individual. Here we're going to say an organism because I'm going to give examples of maybe animals, how we can use chaining to teach a variety of skills, so not only humans, to perform a chain. So the first thing that we need to do, of course, if you're teaching a complex task, is to break that task down into its component elements. And we refer to that as a task analysis. So sometimes people say, we're going to teach a TA, and that means we're going to be teaching a task analysis. And you do teach a task analysis, you do teach a behavior that involves several steps by using chaining. And as you see today, there are different kinds of chaining procedures. So again, we're going to be teaching a task analysis by reinforcing the completion of each one of those behaviors or each one of those links in this behavioral chain. So let's talk about hand washing. So I took these steps from the CDC website. So this is the best way to wash your hands. So the safest possible way to wash your hands. So the first step they describe as wetting your hands with clean running water, warm or cold, turning off the tap, and apply soap. So again, this would be, in a way, you could think about several different steps, but they listed as one of the steps in this task analysis of the most appropriate way to wash your hand. Then lather your hands by rubbing them together with soap, the backs of your hands, between your fingers, and then under your nails, right? So again, they're listing it as a step 2, but we could also break this down into several steps too, right? If you think about it, step 1 could be broken down even further if you think it's necessary to break those steps further. And we could do that. We could say the first step is wetting your hands with clean running water. Then you could say the second step is turning off the tap. And then the third step is applying soap. So we broke down this one step into 3 sub-steps. We could do that with step number 2 here. We can say rubbing them together. That would be another step. And then lather the back of your hands, then between your fingers, and then under your nails, right? So again, we broke that into even smaller steps, and then scrubbing your hands for at least 20 seconds. So you're doing step 2 for at least 20 seconds. And of course, if you don't have a timer, they suggest that you sing happy birthday twice. Now, you're not gonna sing it too fast, nor are you gonna sing it too slow, just like you would normally do. And then, of course, the last step will be rinsing your hands well under clean running water. So if you're teaching a child, for example, to wash their hands, you would want to break the behavior down into those components so the child can engage in the correct behavior. So again, washing our hands, we usually take it for granted. We do it all the time, but there's an appropriate way of doing it. And that appropriate way involves a sequence of behaviors. Here, the CDC lists 4 steps, but we broke those down into even smaller sub-steps, right? That you might have to teach if you're, you might have to use if you're teaching a child, for example. And of course, finally, you have to dry your hands, assuming, of course, with a clean towel. Now, again, we're talking about a stimulus response chain. And I think what's interesting about this is that with the task analysis that I used earlier, so let's go back for a second, every single step serves as a cue or as an antecedent for the next step, right? So after you wash your hands with clean running water, wet your hands with clean running water, step number 1 here, and then you turn off the tap and apply soap, then this is going to cue you into the next behavior, which will be rubbing your hands with the soap, right? Once you have rubbed your hands enough times, you have rubbed your hands and singing happy birthday twice, then the next thing you're going to see the soap in your hand, and the next thing you're going to do is you're going to rinse your hand under clean running water. Once your hands are rinsed and they look clean, then they're going to be wet. And then having wet hands is going to make you want to dry them, right? So getting the towel and so forth. And then finally, once you see your hands clean and dry, you're done, right? That's sort of the ultimate reinforcer, having clean hands. So essentially what I'm suggesting here is that you have discriminative stimuli. So let's give another example. Let's imagine you tell a child to go eat her oatmeal. So go eat your oatmeal. That would be an antecedent event, right? A stimulus that would evoke the behavior of the child, maybe in this case, looking at the bowl of oatmeal and having the spoon in hand will be an antecedent for the child to place the spoon in the food. Now, that's the first behavior. You place the spoon in the food. And now what happens when you place the spoon in the food? Well, you see the spoon in the food, right? So seeing the spoon in the food in a way is the outcome of placing the spoon in the food, is the reinforcer of placing the spoon in the food. It sounds weird to think about that as a reinforcer, but hey, what makes you continue placing the spoon in the food? Well, seeing the spoon in the food. And then, of course, once you see the spoon in the food, you're going to scoop it onto the spoon. And of course, once you see the food on the spoon, then of course that is going to prompt you, or is going to cue you into putting the food into your mouth. And of course, ultimately, the food in your mouth is the reinforcer, right? So the taste of the food in your mouth is the reinforcer, of course, assuming that you, of course, like oatmeal. Here we go, right? Um, Notice that I always have a cue, right, an SD that evokes a behavior, and then immediately after the behavior occurs, that behavior generates another stimulus, in this case S2, that serves as a reinforcer for the first behavior, but also as a discriminative stimulus for the next behavior, right? So here, the second behavior produces a discriminative stimulus for the third behavior, and it serves as a reinforcer for the previous behavior. So again, once you have you scoop the food onto the spoon, that produces the food on the spoon, which is the reinforcer for behavior 2, but it serves as a discriminative stimulus for behavior 3. So again, when we talk about a stimulus response chain or a stimulus response relation, that's what propels the chain forward, right? So each response here changes a stimulus. It produces a stimulus change, and that stimulus change evokes the next response in the chain. That's why we refer to it as a stimulus response chain. Now, again, of course, in this case, the last response in the chain is what results in the most powerful consequence. In this case, it is the oatmeal, right, in your mouth. But again, all the other reinforcers were not that important. So, of course, the oatmeal in your mouth is the most important reinforcer, is the ultimate reinforcer for this behavioral chain, and because it's food, is an unconditioned reinforcer. Well, how about the other reinforcers? How about when you see the spoon in the food? Well, seeing the spoon in the food, of course, reinforces the behavior of placing the spoon in the food, but seeing the spoon in the food is a condition reinforcer, and it is a condition reinforcer because it has been associated ultimately with the oatmeal in your mouth, right? So again, notice that all those stimuli here that serves as discriminative stimulus for the next response serve as condition reinforcers for the behavior that produced them. Right, so in this case, they're all condition reinforcers until, of course, you get to the last consequence here, which is the oatmeal in your mouth. Now, let's think about another example, right? First of all, we have to identify all stimuli and responses in a behavioral chain. And in order to do that, you could consult an expert. Now, of course, if you're trying to teach someone to eat oatmeal, or maybe prepare oatmeal, you probably don't need to consult an expert. I don't think maybe there are some experts in cooking oatmeal, but in the example of washing your hands, I did that, right? So I consulted an expert. In this case, I went to the CDC website and I found out what is the most appropriate way and the safest way for us to wash our hands, so to eliminate all possible viruses and germs and so forth. We can also watch someone else perform the change. So now again, let's go to an example of toothbrushing. If I wanted to teach someone how to brush their teeth, I could, before teaching it, in order to understand all the necessary steps, I could just watch someone else brush their teeth and then write down all the specific steps for that behavior. Finally, I could do it myself. So I could go, brush my own teeth and then take notes to understand exactly what it is that I do. And that's kind of interesting. If I were to ask you now, write down all the steps that you take in the morning when you're getting dressed, you may not know exactly what you do. You may have to perform that tomorrow when you wake up and you change into clothing, from your pajamas into clothing, although some of you might not have a reason to do it if you're not working and staying home. But if you are changing from your clothes to from your pajamas to your regular clothes, then the question is, how do you do that? What are the steps that would take you to undress, and what are the steps that you take to get dressed, right? What is the first thing that you do? And what about the second thing? How about the third thing? So if you were to teach someone how to get dressed, how to undress, and maybe get dressed, you would need to write down all those steps. And you can watch someone else do it and then write them down, or you can perform those behaviors yourself. So those are different ways of doing it. So here's the example of putting on a coat. Maybe you watch someone else put on a coat, or you perform the chain yourself, and then you came up with maybe these specific steps. So the first one will be, well, the sight of the coat is a discriminative stimulus, or is an antecedent event that evokes the response of picking up the coat. Now, once you pick up the coat, what is the reinforcer for picking up the coat? Well, is seeing the coat in your hands. Now, when you see the coat in your hands, you're just not going to stare at the coat and be like, oh, cool. You're going to do something with it. So you're going to place one arm in sleeve, and then you're going to see your arm in that sleeve, and then that is going to make you do something else. So that's the reinforcer that is also going to serve to prompt you or to guide you into placing the other arm the sleeve. And now, of course, you're going to have the coat on. Now, having the coat on may also serve as an antecedent for you to zip up the coat. And of course, once you're done zipping up the coat, in this case, if a child is being taught, the ultimate reinforcer may be somehow artificial. So the teacher may give some praise. Maybe there'll be some, a sticker that the child would earn. Maybe, a treat of some sort. But of course, for all of us, when you're putting the coat on, having the coat on zipped up is the ultimate reinforcer, right? Because now you're going to go outside and you won't be cold. So I just want to make sure that my coat is on, and that's the end of the chain. Now, how do we train the sequence per component? And usually when I teach this class live or in the classroom, I get students to volunteer, and then I sort of demonstrate how to teach some behavioral chains. I usually do like folding a shirt or maybe folding a jacket, depending on, whether if it's nice and warm. I bring a t-shirt on and I teach students how to fold a shirt. If it's cold outside, I may borrow someone's jacket or someone's sweatshirt and then sort of get a volunteer to fold it. But I can't do that online. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be posting a bunch of videos for you with resources on task analysis and chaining. So hopefully that would exemplify how those things are actually done. But usually you're going to present an antecedent stimuli, and you can use either verbal or physical prompt. So in the examples that I gave, all of them involved some sort of verbal prompt, like let's get your oatmeal, and then every single step you could prompt it somehow. And then, of course, there'll be praise. For each component, right? So each component of the chain, you present an SD, you give some sort of prompt, and then you give praise. So if you think about the example of washing your hands. Now, step one will be turning on the water. So the first step would be, okay, let's go wash your hands. And then you may have to give some sort of verbal prompt like, hey, turn on the water. And if verbal prompt doesn't work, you may have to be a little bit more intrusive. You may have to use maybe gestural prompt or maybe some sort of a physical prompt to get the child to turn on the faucet. And by turning on the faucet, which would be the first step, that would produce some sort of reinforcer. And that would be the completion of the first step in the sequence, or the first component in the sequence. You have to do that for every single component. And of course, you're going to have to fade the prompts, because you would want the whole sequence to be completed without any prompts. And once the response occurs without any prompts, then you move on to the next component. So after turning on the faucet will be getting the soap, and that would be the second step in the chain, and you would teach it exact same way. You may have to use verbal or physical prompt, once the step is completed or done correctly, you're going to provide some praise. You're also going to have some way of fading the prompts. And then, of course, once the response occurs without prompts, you go to the next step and so forth. And then you keep going. Now, when you're teaching chaining, so if you're teaching any of those things, you would use either forward chaining or backward chaining or a total task presentation. So let's talk about each one of those, forward chaining and then backward chaining. So I'm going to give you an example of another task analysis, and one that is actually in your book. So if you read the chapter before attending to this lecture, you're going to remember that. So one of the first examples in the book is the example of folding towels, right? So maybe someone works at a hotel, or probably at a restaurant if you have like small little towels for the bathroom. But let's imagine you work for a hotel and you have to fold towels. Now, the example that they give is the first step being grabbing the towels from a bin. Those are assuming washed towels. Now you're going to lay the towel out flat on the table. So you do it, lay it on the table. You can even get a towel at home and then see if you can do that. And then you're going to grab one end and fold it in half. And then the next step will be grabbing another end and folding in half again. And then picking up the folded towel and then putting it in a box, right? So they're going to be boxed up somewhere. Now, we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. So grabbing from bin, laying out flat, grabbing one end and folding in half, grabbing another end and folding in half, picking up the folded towel and then putting in a box. Now, if we're teaching this using forward chaining, we're going to teach the first stimulus response component to mastery first. What is the first component? Will be grabbing the towel from the bin. So you would teach that behavior until the individual can grab the towel from the bin independently, right? So you teach that component first. Once the component is mastered, then you're going to go to the second component, which is now laying it out flat on the table, right? So you do that, and then once that component is mastered, you teach the third component, which will be grabbing one end and folding it in half. Once that's mastered, you go to the next component and so forth until every single component were mastered. Every single component was mastered in that specific sequence, right? So that's why it's called forward chaining, because you start with the first component and then you go down until you reach the last component. Now, what's the ultimate reinforcer here? Well, we'll be seeing the towel in the box, which hopefully leads to either a supervisor providing you some praise or some sort of monetary incentive, something, of course, for you to get the job done. How about backward chaining, right? What would backward chaining look like here? Now, with backward chaining, you complete the first steps for the learner, and then you teach the last stimulus response component, and you teach that to mastery first. So, of course, the sequence is always the same. You can't start with the last step, right? I mean, it would make no sense. You still have to grab it from the bin, laying out flat on the table, grabbing one end and folding it in half. All those things will have to happen in that sequence. But if you're teaching to someone using backward chaining, you will probably start teaching, you will probably complete the beginning tasks for the participant and start by teaching the last task. And why do I say probably? I'll tell you in a second, because you could just start with the last one. So what I could do is I could just pick up a folded towel, give it to the participant or to the learner, and then just teach the learner to put the folded towel into the box, right? So that will be the first thing that you teach, which is actually the last step in your chain. That's why it's called backward chaining. You're teaching the last step first. Of course, oftentimes, if we're teaching this behavior in the clinical setting, what we would do is we would complete the task for the client or we would physically prompt the client to do the whole thing. So we'll physically prompt the client to do the whole thing and then be teaching the last one. So I could just grab it from the bin myself, laying flat myself, grabbing it and folding it myself, and then giving the folded towel to the client, and then the client has to put it on the bin, and I'll give prompting and reinforcement for that behavior. That would be me completing the initial tasks and teaching the last one first. Once the last one is mastered, once my client can put the towel into a box, the folded towel into a box, then I can go and teach the second to last component of the chain. What is the second last component? Picking up the folded towel. So I can grab it from the bin, do all the folding, and then leave it on the table and just teach the client to picking it up. And then, of course, the client already learned the last step, which is putting it in the box. So the client can now do the second to last and the last step independently, right? I can now teach the third to last step, which will be the last folding part. So again, I can grab the towel from the bin myself. I can lay flat on the table. I can do the first half folding. And now I'm going to teach the participant using prompting, possibly verbal or maybe physical prompting to do the last folding part. Once the participant masters that, well, remember, the participant can already picking it up and putting in a box. Now that the participant can do the last folding, I can teach the participant to do the fourth to last task, which would be the first folding. So I can grab it from the bin, I can lay down flat. Now I can physically prompt the client to do the first folding. The client would already know how to do the second folding, how to then pick up the folded towel and put it in a box, and so forth. So you're building up from the back up, right? Now, a better way to understand would be another example that you can visualize the folded towel. Hopefully you wrote it down, you look it in the book, but let's imagine you're teaching this kid here to bowl. So what are some of the steps? Well, we're going to break it down into getting the ball, walking forward, standing at a line, swinging arm back, and then releasing the ball. Well, it's probably have to swim arm back and then forth, of course, and then release the ball. So with forward chaining, what would be the first thing that you would teach? Well, you teach the child to get the ball and then walk forward and then stand in line and then swim the arm back and then releasing the ball. So you would start by teaching the child to get the ball, and you probably would help the child through the next steps, right? You can help her go through it, or you can do it for her using some sort of physical prompt. But if you're doing backward chaining, you would just start by teaching the child to release the ball. So you just put the ball in the child's hand and then teach the child to release the ball. Once the child has mastered how to release the ball, then you just teach the child how to swing the arm back and forth. And of course, the child would already know how to release the ball. So that's kind of the difference, right? With forward chaining, you would start with the first step, get that one mastered, then the second step, get that one mastered, and the third step, the fourth step, and then finally the fifth step. With a backward chaining, you would get the participant to master the last step first. So in this case, the fifth step is mastered first, then you teach the fourth step, then the third step, then the second, and then the first, right? So hopefully this made sense to you, that the difference between forward and backward chaining. The questions, of course, is why the difference and when would you use one versus another? So let's talk about that. So both forward and backward chaining would teach links in the behavioral chain. So when would you use forward chaining? Well, you use forward chaining when the initial steps are easiest. The book doesn't talk about that. The book gives you some other reasons that I also want you to learn, but these are some of the things that I think are important for you to know. Use when the initial steps are easiest, and also when the individuals find the demands a little aversive, right? And this is because a lot of the forward chaining looks a little bit like demand fading. You're starting with one little step, and then once the participant masters that step, you go to the second step. So you're slowly making the task harder. So you start with an easy task, which is one step, and then two steps, and then three steps, and so forth. So usually forward chaining has that advantage, especially if you can just complete the first step and then sort of let it go. And then next, once the first step is mastered, complete the first and the second. So you're kind of slowly making the task harder, but you just don't start with a difficult task right away, which is building it up. Backward chaining, usually we use backward chaining when there is a natural reinforcer at the end of the chain, or when the task termination is a reinforcer. So think about any tasks that involve cooking. Well, what's the ultimate reinforcer for cooking? Well, it's having that meal, and it's a powerful reinforcer. So if you start with backward chaining, you would always start with the last task or the last behavior, which is essentially eating the food. So you start with eating the food, and then once that's mastered, you go to the step right before eating the food. So imagine if you're, making tacos, for example. What is the last probably step on your eating, on making tacos? Well, putting the taco in your mouth and taking a bite. That would be the last step. So you start with that step. Well, that's easy, and that produces the biggest reinforcer. What is the second to last step? Well, it's probably grabbing it from your plate. So you can just grab it from your plate and then put it in your mouth. You're getting the ultimate reinforcer. What is the third to last? Maybe sprinkling some cilantro on top. So you can do that and then picking it up and then putting it in your mouth. So notice that every single time you're going to be contacting the ultimate final reinforcer. So when you're cooking, maybe if you're putting on a coat, where seeing the ultimate or the final reinforcer is very important, you would want to start with backward chaining. Some other uh, chains or task analysis, if the final reinforcer is not that potent, it may not make much sense or much difference using forward or backward. But if for some reason the ultimate reinforcer on that task analysis on that chain is very powerful, you probably would want to start with backward chain. You probably have some questions about that. I love to have a discussion about when to use forward and backward chaining in the discussion board. Now, remember, when you're teaching those things, one of the things that I do is you're going to probe, or you're going to conduct some baseline. So if I'm going to teach toothbrushing with a participant, I may want to see, is there anything in this behavioral chain that the participant can already do? And when I'm probing the participant, if I find out that the first few steps in this chain the participant can already complete, then maybe I should be using forward chaining. But if the participant can already complete a lot of the steps at the end of the chain, then it might be better for me to start with backward chaining, because I would start by teaching steps that are very easy for the participant, or the participant can already perform independently. Now, there are some additional chaining procedures that you're going to see in your book, and those involve the total task presentation. The total task presentation, it's often used to teach tasks that are not very long and they're quite simple, or that the participant already can perform a lot of the tasks in the chain, right? So in this case, the task or the complex chain is taught as a single unit. It requires the learner to be guided through as necessary. So, for example, if you're teaching the folding of the towels, maybe your participant can already do some of those things, right? Maybe the participant can already fold the first half, but not the second. Maybe the participant can already put it in a box. So what you can do is you can just tell your client, hey, why don't you start folding the towel? And I'll be here, and then I will be helping you as needed. So if the participant can perform independently, great. I'll let the participant do it. But if not, I can jump in and use some guided practice. So I can go in and then sort of use this graduated guidance or guided practice in which I can go in and then gradually help the participant by jumping in and prompting if I need to, but if not, I'll let the participant do it independently. Now, a lot of you, if you, let's say, work at a restaurant, and maybe you work in the kitchen, maybe you work at a factory, after you're being taught to engage in some of your tasks, your supervisor may show up and then see how you're doing. And then if you're doing something wrong, or if you make a mistake, or if you're about to make a mistake, your supervisor may jump in and help you out. But the supervisor may only jump in and help you out and use some sort of either verbal or physical prompt as needed, right? So maybe you're operating this machinery and you're about to, press the wrong button. That would be one of the steps in the chain, and your supervisor may say, no, it's the other button. So your supervisor gave you some sort of verbal prompt in one of the steps of the chain. Or maybe you're building something for IKEA and you're looking at the different steps in the description in the manual, and then maybe your significant other sees that you're putting like a piece incorrectly and then can give you a prompt and use what we're referring to as graduated guidance here. So again, if you're teaching the bowling, I can just tell someone, hey, go bowl, and then those are all the steps that you need to engage in. And I can go through all the steps and only prompt if needed. And I can just use verbal prompt and say, hey, remember to walk forward, or remember to stand in line, or swing your arm back. And then if that doesn't work, I may have to jump in and do some physical prompting. So that would be another way of doing it. Another example here, stuffing envelopes. Notice that you start with brochures and envelopes on the table. Then the first behavior is to pick up the brochure. Now you have the brochure in hand, and that's the reinforcer for picking it up, but also an antecedent for the next behavior, picking up the envelope. Now, when you have the brochure and the envelope in hand, that serves to cue the next behavior, which is putting the brochure in the envelope. And that produces the reinforcer, which is the stuffed envelope in hand, which is also discriminative stimulus for you to put the stuffed envelope in the box, and that will lead to praise. So again, if you're doing backward chaining, you would start by presenting the SD4, the stuffed envelopes, and then just teaching the behavior of putting the stuffed envelope in the box, right? And that will produce praise. Once the behavior is mastered, you teach response 3 by presenting the SD3. Once that's mastered, you teach response 2 by presenting SD2. And then finally, once response 2 is mastered, you teach response 1 in the presence of SD1. If you were doing forward chaining, you would start by giving the brochures and the envelopes and putting them on the table, which is SD1, and teaching the individual to pick up the brochure, which then lead to the reinforcer of the brochure in hand. Once that behavior is mastered, you give reinforcement there. Once that behavior is mastered, then now you're going to have the brochure in hand and the envelopes on the table, and you'll be teaching using prompting and fading the individual to pick up the envelope and so forth, right? Now, if you're doing total task presentation, you're going to prompt the learner through all the steps in the chain and then give more or less prompting for each single one of those behaviors as needed, right? So that's the difference between backward chaining, forward chaining, and total task presentation. There are several examples in the book that I suggest that you read. Now, there's a cool video about dogs learning how to drive in New Zealand that I posted a link so you can take a look at. Really cool because even though they don't talk behaviorally, it's just a news video in New Zealand done by a reporter. So they, of course, don't use behavioral terms, but you can see that they talk about chaining the behaviors that they taught the dogs, right? So teaching one behavior at a time until all the behaviors were put together, and then the dog could engage in this very complex response of driving a car. So really cool video. You should watch that. You could pause the YouTube video now and then watch that video and then come back. There are some other strategies that we use to teach complex skills or task analysis, and they may involve um, video modeling and textual prompts and so forth. So I'll talk about that in a second. So again, if you think about forward, backward, and total task presentation, they require a trainer, they require prompting and fading, and that could be problematic, right? You need someone who's trained on how to provide prompting and fading. But there are other strategies to teach complex behavior that may work really well for individuals that are already quite sophisticated. So a written task analysis. Now, of course, they can't teach the dog how to drive the car with written task analysis by telling the dog exactly what the dog should be doing. And as a matter of fact, probably none of us have learned how to drive just by reading a manual on how to do it, right? That wouldn't be enough. So there's definitely, on her learning how to drive, we definitely needed a trainer, and we require some prompting and fading. Some of us went to driving school. Some of us had the unfortunate experience of having our parents prompting and fading. And sometimes their physical prompts may have been quite aggressive, of like, yelling. Some verbal prompt may also have been kind of aggressive in terms of yelling at you if you're doing something wrong, or telling you what you should be doing. Maybe there was a stop sign and you didn't stop, and that's an important skill, and your parents yelled at you, and then was an additional prompt to make you stop, right? The SD of the stop sign wasn't enough, so they had to add the additional screaming prompt to make you stop. Now, other strategies, like I mentioned, you may have a written task analysis, or you may have some picture prompts. And then finally, not finally, video modeling is another one, and then self-instructions. And those strategies involve the independent use of prompts to guide the completion of the task. So I'm going to go through some of those, and I'm going to also be looking at a lot of resources so you can see a lot of examples of how those task analysis and those chaining procedures work, how data collection is done, and so forth. That's what I want to cover in the next lecture, which may involve me, talking, or a lot of resources that I'll post for you to look at as well. So with written task analysis, the trainer presents the learner with a list of component behaviors in the proper sequence, and the learner uses the list to perform the task correctly. Now, it could be instructions to put together a stereo system. I always think about recipes. Now, we're spending a lot of time home and I'm cooking a lot of things. So I'm following a lot of written task analysis, right, on how to make certain things. So they might have this very complicated recipe, and then you have to follow each single step on that very complex task of cooking that meal. We refer to those things as textual prompts. Again, if you put all the ingredients in front of me, that might not be enough to get the behavior of cooking that meal. So I may need specific prompting, right? So I may need specific things specific prompts to tell me exactly what to do. So for textual prompts to be effective, of course, you have to read instructions. So if you're trying to cook and there's a recipe, read the damn recipe. I need to understand the recipe, and that's important too. When I first moved to the States and I started reading recipes and trying to cook, I mean, there are things in the recipes that I didn't understand because the names of the ingredients in Portuguese were very different, and I didn't know what those things were called in English. But also sometimes measurement was different, or names of kitchen items. I mean, I didn't know, the terms for certain kitchen items. So of course, not understanding the instructions didn't help me very much because I was, putting different measurements, and when it was ounces, and I'm thinking it was like milliliters, that didn't really work very well. So you have to understand the instructions, and you have to execute the behavior that is listed in the instructions. There's also picture prompts. I mean, here's some example of like IKEA furniture assembling manual, right? So again, you take a picture of the outcome of each behavior of the person engaging in them. So you see step 1 here on the top, and then step 2 should look like this. This is the outcome of the behavior that you would have engaged. Once you saw all those pieces in step one, you should have done those things to get to step two and so forth. Pictures are used as prompt to the learner, again, to engage in the behaviors in the proper sequence. As I mentioned here, the furniture directions. To be effective, of course, I have to look at the pictures in the proper sequence, and I have to somehow understand, or the pictures must have some control over my behavior. And I never assemble IKEA furniture because they don't. Like, I look at this picture here and I'm like, I have no idea what that is. And I try to match the pieces to the thing, and I can never do it. So I'm one of the few people in Sacramento that probably pay for others to install or to assemble IKEA furniture. I'm like, I don't care how much it costs, but I'm going to spend like hours trying to do this. Finally, video modeling. Hopefully I can find you some resources for that. There's a lot of really cool video modeling that is done in the field of behavior analysis, especially for teaching children and teaching children with disabilities. Kids love their iPads, they love videos. So if you can give them instructions in this format, they're likely to succeed. So here the learner watches a video of someone engaging in the chain of behaviors. It's like a modeling prompt, right? But it's occurring via video. So we already talked about the modeling prompt. The kid may watch the entire video and then try to complete the task, or which would be similar to a total task presentation, or watch each component and then complete one component at a time, right? So it could be similar to a forward chaining in this case. Some people refer to it as video prompting. I have a link here that you can see once I post the PowerPoint, but I'll try to find some other links for you. And then, so again, video modeling is not finally. There's another one here. We refer to those as self-instructions. Now, I can teach the learner how to give them self-instructions or verbal prompts to engage in the correct sequence of behavior. Now, when I used to practice martial arts, there are several different sequences of moves, and I used to memorize the sequence verbally. So when I had to perform them, I would be prompting myself. So I would just talk to myself so I knew exactly the sequence of moves. So when I finish one move, I knew exactly what the next one was going to be. A lot of gymnasts do this. I don't know if you've watched the Olympic Games, but when you do, pay attention to see if any of the gymnasts are moving their lips. And if they're doing it, they might be prompting themselves through the next steps of their performance. So a lot of times people may recite instructions out loud, and then after mastery, of course, recite them covertly, so quietly. Again, teaching young children to tie their shoes, you may want to give them some sort of instructions they can repeat to themselves. Opening a locker in a middle school, reciting digits of a phone number as you dial, and so forth. Some people refer to those as self-generated verbal prompts. And again, to be effective, the learner must be able to remember the self-instructions, say them at the appropriate time, and again, the instructions need to evoke or need to control the behavior. There have been several different studies conducted that the book will talk about. This is an example of one in which they taught shopping skills to 4 adults with mild intellectual disabilities, and check that out. So here we have 21 steps that were taught. If they were teaching it, the adults, through forward chaining, of course, the first behavior would be walking from car to supermarket. That's the behavior that is being taught, prompted with reinforcement. And then once that's mastered, then step number 2 and 3 and so forth. So notice that this is a very complex task that in this case, they broke it down into 21 steps. This is a graph. I'm going to actually post a copy of the study so you guys can take a look at it. So I don't have to go through the details of this graph. You guys can look at yourselves, but you have a multiple baseline across participants here. You have different participants, and then you have the effects of the training across different conditions in which they had a blocking and a non-blocking test. But I'll post the articles for you guys to take a look at it. I'm not going to be asking any questions about this article on the exam. but I want you to see an example of a paper that has done this. So when do you use behavioral training? The question is it the right procedure? Is it, do you need to learn a new behavior, or is it that the individual is not performing the behavior because of some reason? There's some non-compliance, and that has to do with the can do versus won't do. If the person cannot do, then that chaining might be the correct procedure. But if it's a won't do issue, if the participant knows how to perform the task, but it's just not doing it, that's a lack of reinforcement, of lack of motivation. Chaining would not be appropriate. Then we have to develop a task analysis. Remember, you can develop a task analysis by performing the test yourself, asking an expert, or observing someone else do it. You collect baseline data to find out, can the participant do any of the steps in the chain? That would also help you determine whether you're going to use forward or backward chaining. And that's when you choose the one that you're going to use. Remember, if there's a powerful reinforcer at the end, start by using backward chaining. So then the last step, the first step that you teach, so the individual can contact this large final reinforcer. And then, of course, continue to collect data. And then once there's a lot of reinforcement initially, you fade the reinforcement. Well, that's all I had for behavioral chain. For the next class, I'm going to give you a lot of resources on chaining, so you guys can master this. My suggestion is, after watching this video, go to the back of chapter 11. There's a lot of questions about chaining, a lot of examples. Take a look at those, answer those questions. That will prepare you for the exam. And again, keep an eye out for class on Wednesday, in which I'm going to describe a lot of resources and post a lot of resources on using behavioral chain. Well, again, hopefully everyone is safe. And if you have any questions, please post in the discussion board or email me. I would also be posting an announcement about office hours. If you want to meet with me Monday afternoon, sorry, today's Sunday afternoon. That's when I'm recording this. So if you want to meet with me Monday afternoon during my regular office hours, I'm going to give you an opportunity to schedule time to meet with me, so we can, I can send you a link and we can meet via Zoom. Again, hopefully everyone is safe and enjoying the time that you have socially isolating, but hopefully you're finding many things to do, one of which could be studying for this class. See you guys soon. Bye.